This morning, I don't know who needs to hear this, but the patterns that fought your parents, the patterns that stalked your destiny, the patterns that waited for you the moment you opened your eyes, today they will break. As you have stepped into this morning, you have stepped into a divine appointment. I see the Lord interrupting the cycle that has repeated itself for years. What stopped you before will not stop you again. What limited you before will not limit you again. What embarrassed you before will not embarrass you again. This is your morning of holy interruption. There is a stirring in the spirit, and I hear the Lord saying, enough is enough. Every evil pattern that has made you cry, every circle that has returned, every time you thought you were free, every delay that suddenly reappears, every disappointment that comes right when you are about to rise, this morning it loses its power. You are not repeating the pain of yesterday. You are not inheriting the battles that did not start with you. You are stepping into a fresh season where the old scripts are erased by fire. Heaven is standing at attention over your destiny. As you lift your voice this morning, God is lifting the burdens you didn't even know you were carrying. As you pray, God is uprooting the foundations you didn't even build. As you declare, God is realigning everything that has been out of order. This is the morning where ancient altars collapse, where negative cycles scatter, where everything that has resisted your rising finally bows. The atmosphere is charged. Grace is available. Power is moving. Get ready. This morning, evil patterns are breaking forever. When we talk about breaking every inherited and recurring evil pattern that has limited your progress and delayed your destiny, we are not speaking lightly. We are addressing the invisible battles that shape visible outcomes. These patterns are the unseen scripts that try to dictate your life without your permission. They are the repeated frustrations you can't explain, the cycles that resurrect themselves just when you think you have escaped. They are the delays that come without warning, the disappointments that appear at the edge of your breakthrough, the setbacks that look strangely familiar. And many times, these patterns didn't start with you. They came from generations before you, traveling like shadows, lurking around your destiny, waiting for opportunities to manifest. But God did not bring you into this morning to repeat the same story. He brought you here to break it. There are people who have done everything right, worked hard, prayed, planned, prepared, yet the results never match the effort. Not because they are weak, not because they are careless, but because something older than them keeps fighting them. You see traces of it in your family line. The same struggles, the same limitations, the same failures at the same point in life. A pattern is anything that repeats itself without permission, anything that cycles back without invitation. For some, it is a pattern of rising and falling. Just when you start to make progress, something disrupts it. For others, it is a pattern of delay. Good things take too long, opportunities slip away, doors that should open stay stubbornly shut. For some, it is a pattern of rejection. Whenever favor finds them, something suddenly turns people against them. For others, it is stagnation. No matter how much they try, their life refuses to move. And then there are patterns of health issues that appear exactly the same way in each generation. Patterns of financial hardship that no one seems to break out of. Patterns of marital struggles that repeat themselves in the lives of children just the way they did in their parents. Patterns of sudden loss, breakdowns, constant battles, unnecessary warfare, and unexplained attacks. Patterns that make people fear their future because they already know how things will turn out. These are not coincidences. These are not random. These are evil patterns Cycles designed to keep you contained, confined, restricted, and limited. But child of God, this is the morning heaven has decided that enough is enough. When God steps into a matter, cycles break. When his fire shows up, old altars collapse. When his voice speaks, patterns lose their authority. And this morning, the hand of God is stretching into every area of your life where those patterns have taken root. Every area where you unknowingly inherited battles that did not originate with you. Every area where negative cycles have hidden themselves and grown quietly. The Spirit of God is shining light into places that have been dark for too long. Because before a pattern breaks physically, it breaks spiritually. Before it collapses in your life, it collapses in the realm of the Spirit. And that is what is happening in this moment. Heaven is interrupting the script that has tried to run your destiny. Some patterns disguise themselves as personality. You think you're just unlucky or introverted or not good at opportunities, but in truth, something has been fighting your rising. Some patterns disguise themselves as normal life. Everyone in my family struggles financially. No one in my family finished school. Marriage never works in our bloodline. But God never intended for you to inherit the pain of your ancestors. He intended for you to inherit grace, glory, favor, and purpose. The enemy wants patterns to feel normal so that you don't challenge them. But this morning, God is opening your eyes. He is showing you that what you thought was natural is spiritual. What you thought was coincidence is a cycle. And what you thought would continue forever is about to end by fire. There are doors you should have entered years ago, but a pattern kept blocking them. There are levels you should have attained by now, but a cycle kept pulling you down. There are blessings that have always been close, yet never fully yours. There are opportunities that always slip through your fingers. These are not random. Patterns stay in a family line because no one confronts them spiritually. They feed on silence. They feed on acceptance. They feed on the belief that this is just how life is. But when a person rises with revelation, when a person stands with spiritual authority, when a person refuses to inherit what is not from God, the cycle breaks. And this morning, you are that person. You are the interrupter of patterns in your family. You are the one heaven has chosen to carry a new story. There are people listening to this who have lived with invisible chains for so long that the chains feel normal. But in this moment, the Spirit of God is breaking those chains. Every inherited limitation that has followed you like a shadow is losing its grip. Every ancestral covenant that has claimed ownership of your future is being scattered. Every repeating problem that has mocked your prayers is being silenced. Every cycle that has overstayed its time is ending. You are stepping out of agreements you never made. You are stepping out of battles you never started. You are stepping out of patterns that have nothing to do with God's plan for your life. Lift your spirit because God is lifting you. What held you down? What slowed you down? What trapped you in the same place year after year is breaking. Every evil pattern that said you would never rise beyond a certain level is being destroyed. Every cycle of almost there but not yet, started but didn't finish, worked hard but got nothing, is collapsing. The power of God is rewriting your destiny. You are not destined to repeat pain. You are not destined to inherit unfinished stories. You are not destined to be a victim of cycles designed to frustrate your purpose. You are destined for elevation, for impact, for greatness, for divine assignment. And let me tell you, patterns don't break through good intentions. They break through prayer, through fire, through spiritual warfare, through divine intervention. And that is exactly what God is releasing over you this morning. This is not a gentle correction. It is a violent rearrangement. Patterns don't politely leave. They are uprooted. Cycles don't bow quietly. They surrender by force. And that force is present. That authority is speaking. That fire is moving. Every voice that spoke against your rising is being silenced. Every curse that circulated in the family is being neutralized. Every disappointment that tried to repeat itself is being interrupted. The God who breaks chains is breaking patterns. The God who parts the sea is parting cycles. The God who lifts the humble is lifting you. You will not rise and fall anymore. You will not start and stop anymore. You will not be sabotaged at the last minute anymore. You will not repeat what your parents went through. You will not walk the same painful paths. You will not carry the same burdens. You will not fight the same battles endlessly. There is a divine shift happening in your story. Heaven is rewriting your narrative. What hindered those before you will not hinder you. What stopped others will not stop you. What defeated others will not defeat you. You are the exception. You are the interruption. You are the new pattern of blessing that your family has never seen. Because when God breaks a pattern, He doesn't just remove the cycle, He replaces it with a new one, a pattern of elevation, a pattern of divine speed, a pattern of favor, a pattern of answered prayers, a pattern of supernatural breakthroughs, a pattern of open doors, a pattern of victory, a pattern of testimonies. You are not just breaking out of old cycles, you are stepping into a new flow of grace, a new rhythm of success, a new season of unstoppable rising. This morning is not ordinary. This prayer is not casual. This moment is not coincidence. Heaven is performing surgery on your destiny. The old is falling apart. The new is emerging. And every evil pattern that has limited your progress and delayed your destiny is breaking permanently through the power of God's presence, moving over you right now. Grace is rewriting your story, aligning you with divine opportunities, and lifting you into realms you were created to occupy. What was once a burden becomes a testimony, and what was once a barrier becomes a doorway. Step forward with faith. Your season of restoration, favor, and unstoppable advancement has begun. When you declare a divine reset where old cycles end and a new season of breakthrough, speed, and supernatural alignment begins, you are stepping into a moment where heaven interrupts everything that has been misaligned in your life. A divine reset is not just a fresh start. It is a spiritual recalibration where God reaches into the blueprint of your destiny and begins to reorder what was out of place, restore what was lost, revive what was weak, and realign what has been pulled off track. It is a moment where God resets the timelines of your life, adjusts the seasons of your life, and brings everything into harmony with His perfect will. For years, many people have struggled, not because they lacked potential, but because their destiny was out of alignment. Things did not happen at the right time. Opportunities came when they were not prepared, or preparation came when no opportunity was present. Relationships that were supposed to lift them instead delayed them. Doors that should have opened early opened too late. But when God releases a divine reset, everything begins to return to its ordained position. There are people listening who have wondered why their journey has felt so heavy, why progress has been slow, why the wrong people keep showing up, why blessings seem to leak, why there is always a disconnect between what they know they are called to be and what they currently experience. This is not because God has forgotten you. It is because life has layered you with things that do not belong to you. Experiences that were never part of your destiny. Connections that were never meant to stay. Expectations that were never meant to shape you. And cycles that were never meant to define you. A divine reset strips away everything that is not aligned with God's plan. It uproots the wrong foundations. It shuts down unhealthy cycles. It silences distracting voices. It breaks the influence of wrong relationships. It cancels the power of unnecessary battles. It refreshes your spiritual stamina, and it restores your original pace, your divine pace. When God resets you, he resets your identity. He reminds you who you are in him. He removes the labels you have carried, labels placed by failure, by people, by circumstances, by the enemy. He resets your confidence, renewing your strength to believe again, dream again, try again, rise again. He resets your expectations so you do not approach the future from a place of fear or disappointment, but from a place of faith and boldness. A divine reset is heaven's announcement that the old chapter has expired. The old struggles are no longer authorized. The old version of you is no longer needed. God is calling you into the upgraded version of yourself, the version that is equipped, anointed, empowered, and aligned with what he has prepared for your future. When cycles end, your spirit feels the shift even before your circumstances do. Suddenly, the things that used to drain you lose their power. The fears that used to intimidate you lose their voice. The temptations that used to trap you lose their attraction. The battles that used to repeat themselves lose their access. A divine reset is God cutting the cord to the past, disconnecting you from old struggles, dismantling old patterns, and delivering you from cycles that kept you in circles. Some people have walked through years of delay, years of stagnation, years of confusion, years of recurring disappointments. But when God resets your life, delay turns into acceleration, stagnation into movement, confusion into clarity, and divine appointments. In a divine reset, God reorders your environment. He brings people who align with your purpose and removes those who sabotage it. He opens doors that connect to your assignment and shuts doors that drain energy and time. He places you in the right spaces at the right moments with the right grace. He positions you in ways that human logic cannot explain. He releases opportunities that bypass normal processes. I bow you back to him. He accelerates timelines that previously felt stuck. He causes things that normally take years to happen in months or even weeks. Alignment is not just about relationships. It is about timing, placement, and positioning. When God aligns you, everything that used to fight you begins to work for you. Everything that was slow begins to move quickly, and everything that felt chaotic begins to find order. Divine alignment brings harmony between your purpose and your environment, between your calling and your opportunities, between your preparation and your manifestation. Many people are gifted but misaligned, called but mispositioned, anointed but surrounded by the wrong systems. But when a divine reset happens, it is like heaven presses a button that pulls every scattered piece of your life back into divine order. Suddenly, your gifts find expression. Your voice gains authority. Your presence carries weight. Your ideas gain traction. Your efforts produce results. The way you pray shifts, the way you think shifts, and the way you speak shifts. It is as though the fog lifts and you see your path clearly for the first time in a long time. A divine reset means the season that resisted you is over And the season that recognizes you is beginning. There are seasons where no matter what you do, nothing moves, nothing grows, nothing responds. You feel invisible, overlooked, forgotten. But when God resets your season, he brings you into your Kairos moment. The divine timing when heaven and earth agree concerning your rising. Suddenly, visibility increases, resources align, helpers appear, doors open, paths clear, the right relationships emerge. Your voice begins to matter in the rooms you enter. The grace on your life becomes undeniable. This is what happens when old cycles end and a new season begins. Cycles end when God says enough. Cycles end when your spirit says no more. Cycles end when your hunger for change becomes louder than your fear of transition. Some cycles have lasted because you tolerated them. Some have lasted because you learned to function inside them. Some lasted because you thought they were normal. But when God resets your life, he confronts everything you accepted that was never his will for you. He exposes everything that pretended to be part of your destiny but was actually detouring you. He reveals every connection, every pattern, and every environment that was secretly draining your potential. And then he empowers you to walk away, rise above, and step into something new. You may not feel ready, but divine resets do not depend on your readiness. They depend on God's timing. When he decides it is your season, nothing can delay it. Nothing can stop it. Nothing can block it. Nothing can sabotage it. Heaven does not ask permission from earthly situations. Heaven does not negotiate with cycles. Heaven does not check your emotions before resetting your life. When God says your season has changed, everything around you begins to shift. Even when you cannot see it yet, your spirit recognizes it before your eyes do. This new season is not a repeat of your past. It is not a recycled version of what you have experienced before. It is not a continuation of old pain wearing a new outfit. It is a fresh beginning, written by the hand of God himself. You are stepping into supernatural speed, where things that were once slow suddenly accelerate. You are stepping into breakthrough, where long-standing walls finally crumble. You are stepping into alignment, where everything that belongs to your destiny begins to attach itself to you. Your life is being reset into order, purpose, clarity, and divine direction. Divine resets also bring restoration, not just of what you lost, but of what you never had the chance to receive. God restores wasted years, missed seasons, forgotten dreams, abandoned callings. He resurrects what felt dead. He heals what was damaged. He revives what was dormant. When alignment comes, restoration follows. When cycles break, healing flows. When seasons shift, destiny unfolds. This is the morning where heaven recalibrates your life, realigns your steps, resets your journey, and launches you into a future that is bigger, brighter, faster, and more divine than anything you have ever walked in before. Every hidden blessing begins to surface. Every closed door starts to open. And every divine connection assigned to your destiny begins to locate you. Walk boldly. This is not just a new day. It is a heavenly intervention, a supernatural turning point, and the beginning of a chapter where everything finally aligns in your favor.